Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radioverse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, July 26, 2025. We have two great interviews in celebration of the anniversary of the July 26 movement and the start of the Cuban Revolution. It was on this day in 1953 that Fidel Castro and his rebel forces attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago. And this is widely considered the catalyst for the revolution that eventually overthrew the Batista regime. So we're going to begin with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined first on the line by María Elena Díaz, associate professor of history at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and author of the book From Colonial Cuba to Madrid, Litigating Collective Freedom and Native Rights in the Spanish Empire, 1780 to 1814. After that, Dr. Horne will be in conversation with Sara Kozameh, assistant professor at the University of California at San Diego and researcher in the Cuban Revolution, popular uprisings, and black radicalism. It is yet another packed hour of knowledge you can only get right here on KPFK 90.7 FM. So let's hear from our very own KPFK's Gary Baca about why you should support us here on Freedom Now at KPFK.
Once again, we're back for Freedom Now, 818-985-5735. We're in our fund drive. If you haven't pledged for Freedom Now, this program hosted by Dr. Gerald Horne, please call now and pledge your support for this incredible historian, 818-985-5735. Gerald Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. In 1992, Horne was a candidate for the U.S. Senate on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He has published exclusively on W.E.B. Du Bois and has written books on neglected episodes of world history, including Hawaii and the Pacific. He writes about topics he perceives as misrepresented struggles for justice. In particular, communist struggles and struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. Much of his work highlights and analyzes specific individuals in their historic contexts. such as Lawrence Dennis, a man described as the brains behind American fascism. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, and your dollars go to support this programming, the programs here on KPFK, future programs, and the training of youth here at KPFK for the next generation. You are bringing KPFK into the future by calling 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Currently, I'm training young people. Just recently, I spoke at a high school for young kids in media relations at Dorsey High School in Los Angeles. It was an hour class, and I told the youth how important the media is to the community and my struggle in getting to where I'm at now. I believed in this station so much that I would do anything, and I'm still like that to this day. I would do anything for this station to keep it alive. I'm a yes man. Whenever I get a request or someone needs help here at the station, I always say yes, or always find a way to make it happen. And I think that's why some of us are so valuable, is that we're not no men. We don't say, nope, can't do it. And believe me, there's people here at Pacifica that did that are no longer here. They were just like, no, we can't do that. No, we can't broadcast from there. No, we can't make it happen. No, we don't have the dollars. No, we don't have the equipment. You know, that was said, and it was accepted. And it's still accepted to this day because we are on a budget, on limited funds. But if we can try to make it happen with hard work, dedication, volunteering, putting our time into it, we can make it happen. Not everything is about money. This is blood, sweat, and tears. If you believe in that statement, if there was a way that you can put your money into activism, here it is. 818-985-5735. We're in for the big fight. These 3.5 years are going to be tough, but we're going to be right here with you. 818-985-5735 and pledge your support at any amount. $25 to Dr. Gerald Horne and Freedom Now would be appreciated. Imagine if we could get at least 10 of you to pledge $25. That would be over $200. 818-985-5735. Imagine pledging $200 and we can make a match out of that. You can challenge someone else who listens to Freedom Now to pledge $200. If you pledge that $200, we can make $400 and double our money. 818-985-5735. 818-985-KPFK. Let me say it slowly. 818-985-KPFK or pledge online at kpfk.org. Now back to Freedom Now.
Now that you've decided to make your pledge, I want to remind you that I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Cuba's own Palo, Cannonball Adderley, Horace Silver, Robert Glasper, Marco Sariel, and Paul Desmond. Now people get ready for this train to come in, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for this interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor María Elena Díaz.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is María Elena Díaz, Associate Professor of History at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and author of the book From Colonial Cuba to Madrid, Litigating Collective Freedom and Native Rights in the Spanish Empire, 1780 to 1814. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio, Professor Elena Díaz.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Horne.
So why did you write this book?
Why did I write this book? Okay, this book is, for several reasons that I find important, particularly in the historiography. So let me pull back for a moment and summarize the main line of this book, which is, this is a story, okay, or a study of a village of royal slaves and free people of African descent in eastern Cuba, okay, who lived as in quasi-freedom, okay, as a village, which is a very unusual kind of setting. And for almost a century, so several generations of people in this village lived under these unusual arrangements of quasi-freedom. Okay. However, in 1781, and we can talk about the reasons that led to that, these arrangements were upended, and more than 1,000 men, women, and children in that village, those deemed royal slaves, were enslaved, were forcibly removed from the village, and they were sold, okay, in the different growing slave markets emerging in the island. So these triggered, as a response from the free people that were spared the enslavement because of their formal condition as free, the status of the others, of those deemed royal slaves, which lived in de facto freedom in many ways, okay, those were the ones that were enslaved. So these free people left behind some maybe 400 cobreros, as the natives or members of this village, El Cobre, in eastern Cuba, were named. They filed an amazing freedom suit, okay, for wrongful enslavement on behalf of the community. Okay. But these became the most important, the largest, most important, and most complex freedom lawsuit in the Spanish Empire, I would say, in the 18th century and part of the 19th century. And why was it so important and unusual in a way? Okay. First of all, it was a collective freedom suit. Okay. Most freedom suits, and there were freedom suits, freedom actions all over Latin America, Brazil, even in the United States, in all of these slave societies. But most of them were individual or family-based. Okay. This one, however, involved more than 1,000 plaintiffs, okay? And it was done collectively, maybe like a class action today, we could think so, but it was more than a class action because it was also what we can call a corporate action. It was filed in the name or on behalf of the natives of El Cobre, okay? So in the name of a village, okay? And that becomes very important, that type of community, a pueblo, okay? So here I focus on not only the collective freedom for civil freedom that these litigants are making, but also the political freedoms that are implied in their claim to be recognized as a community with lands for the community, communal lands in reality. In this sense, what they were asking for was a recognition as a Spanish or as an Indian community, but as a community ruled by them. So it's important, the collective freedom, the notion of nativeness, of I am a native, a local native of this community. What does it mean? What does it entail politically and legal to mobilize that category, which has usually been ignored by historians, taken for granted, origin. But these people mobilize it in a particular way, and I'm interested in the implications of that, which are oftentimes kind of used today too. So this nativeness at the local level, but it has different scales. Nativeness later is at the national level. It could be at the imperial level too. But here what's important is the local level in an absolute monarchy. And then also I explore the judicial mobilization as a form of political mobilization in here. This is an astounding kind of lawsuit, transatlantic. These people send their own representative from the community all the way to the Supreme Council of the Indies, the highest imperial court, and to make their claims. How were they able to pull this off? Okay, what kinds of resources, what kind of networks, what kind of allies did they need to pull these tremendous litigation off in Madrid and at the local level simultaneously? Okay, so this is what I'm interested in this community and or in this book in particular. And one of the interests that I have in here, when you're asking me why I wrote this book, this is the second book. This is like a sequel on a first book that I wrote also on this community of El Cobre. But the period was before that, and the story there was the formation of this unusual community, okay? And what allowed it, kind of a military colony in a frontier society, in the frontier with other imperial powers. And that particular situation gave them possibilities to negotiate a series of arrangements that gave them autonomy and allowed them to live kind of almost on their own, except for military services and services in labor like Indians had in the fortification projects of the crown. Okay, so that book there and this one then focusing more on the judicial mobilization in the period after they were enslaved, and the whole previous 100 years that I studied in the other book were reversed with this reenslavement, okay? And I study why reenslavement at this time, okay? And this was a time of imperial reform, if you want to, in Spain, in the Spanish Empire. This was a time that imperial reform in the Caribbean, and particularly in Cuba, led to the plantation regime, okay, to the second slavery in Cuba, the sugar economy, okay? And the historiography has focused on Cuba and on that kind of issues and questions, 19th century plantation agriculture, plantation slavery, the second slavery, we call it, that emerged in this period in the Atlantic world, also in the U.S. South, okay? But what I'm interested in is shifting the gaze of the historiography, okay, into another region that has not been studied that much, Eastern Cuba, okay? Santiago de Cuba is the second city, or second capital of the colony, which was more backward, if you want, next to fast developing Havana with the plantation regime. But here we have, so I was interested in moving then, how about these other important regions? Why the neglect? How about if we move to the 18th century? All the attention on Cuba has been on the peak of the sugar export economy in the 19th century. And then issues about abolition, slave trade, revolts, and marronage. So here I wanted to explore other kinds of everyday practices in this community that signal autonomy and freedom. Acts of marronage, because there was conflict throughout the whole century. And then now, after 1781, where this book begins, I want to look at also this judicial mobilization, okay? Not instead of Marronage, but alongside it, in tandem, they were intertwined, particularly in this case, okay? Where they were simultaneous, the litigation was going on, and there were acts of Marronage by many in the community who did not want to wait until this case was resolved, okay? And that put pressure on the litigation process, I think, particularly in the 1990s. This whole litigation process lasted from 1984, okay, 4 years after the reenslavement, until 1800, where the Crown issued a freedom edict, giving them freedom and recognizing them as a community. So there my question was, how come did the Crown grant freedom, okay? Particularly in a context where the whole orientation of whole imperial orientation and the colonial orientation was pro-slavery, pro-expansion of the sugar regime. How could these people pull off and win this litigation for freedom and recognition as a community? Okay. And finally, one more thing also, that when I was looking at, well, what new issues this brings into the historiography here, I explore other forms of slavery. Okay, so not just plantation slavery, not even domestic slavery, but this thing called royal slavery. They were slaves of the king, and the particular shape it took in these contexts. Okay, so that's it. If you want to now ask me some follow-up questions, we can take it from there.
Well, finally, Professor Diaz, Associate Professor of History, University of California, Santa Cruz, author of the book From Colonial Cuba to Madrid, you focus on Eastern Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
Any reverberations in your pages concerning Haiti or pre-revolutionary Haiti and or Jamaica?
Okay, good. Basically, Haiti, this whole conflict comes up in the Spanish Empire with imperial reforms. Like today, let's make the empire great again, a declining empire. So all of these imperial reforms led in Eastern Cuba to the Crown's interest in an extractive industry, which was copper mining. And copper was a strategic resource for military reasons and weaponry. Okay, so that's the interest in the Crown in reviving the mines and in privatizing then this whole mining jurisdiction, and with it, lands, slaves, and mines. Okay, and here is where the conflict comes of the reenslavement. Okay, how did Haiti come in? So these people start their mobilization, okay, before there's a revolution in Haiti. This is in the 1780s, I'm sorry. But in the 1790s, once Haiti comes up, Haiti does not have, I think, a direct impact on the local case. In fact, what's interesting here is the triangulation of the process: imperial level, colonial level, and local level. Colonial officials refuse to even follow orders when the Crown starts shifting its interest and starts saying, okay, we need to attend to these issues. We might need to free these people and want them back in the Crown, back in their country, in their community, in their pueblo, because there's a revolution next door. Okay, so for security reasons, the Crown then starts moving and pushing for and being inclined to give a freedom edict, even if it's opposed by colonial officials and the private interest in Eastern Cuba and in Havana. So that is the impact of Haiti, more indirect, okay? in how it influences up there, in the imperial view, the security questions. But what's interesting here is the kind of freedom that these people are asking for, sort of kind of the alternative to the plantation regime that they're presenting to the Council of the Indies, okay, as a community of small farmers, okay, instead of a plantation regime. And we can see kind of proto-abolitionist kinds of an abolitionist discourse coming up in the memorials that they present to the Crown. Okay, so those are the issues, and it's interesting also to see how at the local level the voices of this community are reflected in the documentation. We have correspondence between the representative in Madrid, okay, and the apoderados, the leaders of the community. So those are very, very important voices to recover that we usually do not, because these voices are usually mediated kind of even through legal documents. So that is a question there of the Greater Caribbean. And the indigenous, the native claims is to kind of apply, it's ambiguous, because what they're wanting is a free pueblo with political rights. But the term native in the Spanish Empire has two connotations, kind of native. In Spain, they use it, native of a village, native of a province, okay? And it's used also in the overseas colonies. But it also has a meaning of indigeneity, of natives are called naturales too. So it is ambiguous in the memorial how they use it also, either to claim that they are indigenous or have indigenous ancestry, or that they're like indigenous because there were also indigenous people who lived in the community originally. So that gives them access to the same rights, okay, to land, to live as a pueblo, to litigate communally, and all of these series of things.
Actually, well, Professor Diaz, I'm afraid we're up against the tyranny of the clock, so I'm going to have to leave it there. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Okay, thank you very much.
Once again, we're back for Freedom Now, 818-985-5735. We're in our fund drive. If you haven't pledged for Freedom Now, this program hosted by Dr. Gerald Horne, please call now and pledge your support for this incredible historian, 818-985-5735. Gerald Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. In 1992, Horne was a candidate for the U.S. Senate on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He has published exclusively on W.E.B. Du Bois and has written books on neglected episodes of world history, including Hawaii and the Pacific. He writes about topics he perceives as misrepresented struggles for justice, in particular, communist struggles and struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. Much of his work highlights and analyzes specific individuals in their historic contexts, such as Lawrence Dennis, a man described as the brains behind American fascism. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, and your dollars go to support this programming, the programs here on KPFK, future programs, and the training of youth here at KPFK for the next generation. You are bringing KPFK into the future by calling 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Currently, I'm training young people. Just recently, I spoke at a high school for young kids in media relations at Dorsey High School in Los Angeles. It was an hour class, and I told the youth how important the media is to the community and my struggle in getting to where I'm at now. I believed in this station so much that I would do anything, and I'm still like that to this day. I would do anything for this station to keep it alive. I'm a yes man. Whenever I get a request or someone needs help here at the station, I always say yes, or always find a way to make it happen. And I think that's why some of us are so valuable, is that we're not no men. We don't say, nope, can't do it. And believe me, there's people here at Pacifica that did that are no longer here. They were just like, no, we can't do that. No, we can't broadcast from there. No, we can't make it happen. No, we don't have the dollars. No, we don't have the equipment. That was said, and it was accepted. And it's still accepted to this day because we are on a budget, on limited funds. But if we can try to make it happen with hard work, dedication, volunteering, putting our time into it, we can make it happen. Not everything is about money. This is blood, sweat, and tears. If you believe in that statement, if there was a way that you can put your money into activism, here it is. 818-985-5735. We're in for the big fight. These 3.5 years are going to be tough, but we're going to be right here with you. 818-985-5735 and pledge your support at any amount. $25 to Dr. Gerald Horne and Freedom Now would be appreciated. Imagine if we could get at least 10 of you to pledge $25. That would be over $200. 818-985-5735. Imagine pledging $200 and we can make a match out of that. You can challenge someone else who listens to Freedom Now to pledge $200. If you pledge that $200, we can make $400 and double our money. 818-985-5735. 818-985-KPFK. Let me say it slowly. 818-985-KPFK or pledge online at kpfk.org. Now back to Freedom Now.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Sara Kozameh, Assistant Professor at the University of California at San Diego, whose research concerns the Cuban Revolution, popular uprisings, and Black radicalism. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Kozameh.
Thank you for having me.
And you're writing a book tentatively entitled Harvest of Revolution. What does it concern?
Yes, that is correct. That's the tentative title, Harvest of Revolution. And the rest of the title for now is Agrarian Reform and the Making of Revolutionary Cuba. It is going to span, well, it was originally supposed to span from about 1958 to about 1970-71. But I've now sort of moved the initial starting date back, which I'll get into that a little bit later. But the book is about agrarian reform in the Cuban Revolution, and it gets forgotten. But the 1959 law of agrarian reform was perhaps the most important law in the Cuban Revolution. It was the most critical legislation in terms of being able to dismantle the older structures, economic, social, and political structures that governed Cuba pre-1959. And so when I sort of realized this, I thought, oh, okay, no one's really written a book about what that agrarian reform looked like. And so I embarked on a project for my PhD dissertation to sort of find out. And my thought was that I wanted to not look at what others have already looked at, which is the speeches given by Fidel Castro about agrarian reform, or the more top-down stories, the state-centered stories about agrarian reform, but rather what it looked like for people on the ground, for regular people, and moreover, the people who participated in making that agrarian reform a reality. And just to be clear, when we're talking about agrarian reform, that encompasses land reform, so changes to the structures of land tenancy, who owns the land, who can farm the land. But it also, in the Cuban Revolution, encompassed a lot more. Agrarian reform meant change to sort of rural life as people knew it. There were very few schools in most of rural Cuba, and the revolution brought schools, it brought doctors, it brought hospitals, it brought, things that we take for granted, like toilets. Most people didn't have running water. And so it was sort of a modernization project that happened starting in 1959 after that law. The other reason why I thought it was really important to look at this question is because there's 60-something years of an embargo now from the United States to Cuba, and that was the origin point of the embargo, what Cubans call the blockade. It happened as a sort of effect of this sort of tit-for-tat war between the United States and Cuba after the law was passed and after the Cuban government began to nationalize and expropriate land from U.S. business owners. And so then they expropriated and nationalized the entire sugar industry, and the United States government was not very fond of that. They had been in control of that industry essentially in Cuba for a long time, and then instituted the embargo. So I thought, okay, this agrarian reform law thing is pretty important. It's a big deal. We should know more about it. So that was the sort of catalyst for doing this research project.
Mm-hmm. Now, with regard to pre-1959 Cuba, pre-revolutionary Cuba, was there Black participation in the Communist Party that precedes and leads up to January 1st, 1959?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this is a great question. And this is the answer to why I thought I was writing a book about 1959 and beyond. And really, as I did my research, I started realizing I was writing a book about 1958 and beyond. And one short year doesn't mean much, but when I got into the archives and the documents about the guerrilla insurgency in eastern Cuba, I realized there was a huge story there. There's an important story about Afro-descended Cubans fighting for land, many of whom were participants or members of the Communist Party or other such groups and followings in the area. So the Communist Party had been illegalized, but a lot of people had been members beforehand or were just secret underground members. So there's many ways that this sort of ideological question manifested itself. But it seemed to have been particularly strong in the eastern areas of Cuba where land dispossession had been also very strongly felt, and where U.S. corporate sugar companies had essentially taken over massive amounts of land. So I sort of, in the research that I did, I established a link between land struggles in the 1930s, which I'll talk about in a second, and the struggle, the guerrilla insurgency in 1958 in eastern Cuba. So the fight against Batista, Fulgencio Batista, dictator in Cuba, that Fidel Castro, his brother Raúl, and all the other 26th of July movement guerrillas were fighting against, begins in the Sierra Maestra, which is slightly west of Santiago de Cuba. Fidel and Che Guevara and Raúl put up their sort of guerrilla base in the Sierra Maestra. But in 1958, in March of 1958, they expand their territory further east, and they move into, Raúl Castro is given a sort of commandership, and he is sent to another mountain range further east in the area of Guantanamo, called Sierra Cristal. It's sort of north of Santiago and near Guantanamo. And this is an area that was majority, an area in which many of the municipalities, Alto Songo, Guantanamo, San Luis, El Caney, and Santiago de Cuba, were majority Afro-descended populations. Those areas had been the foci of long-held land struggles to obtain ownership of the land or simply just not get kicked off of the land by the US companies that had been moving in since Cuba's independence. And so I realized that the sort of lineage from what was going on in 1958 and what happened in 1959 with the land law went back much further, because when Raúl Castro arrives with his guerrillas to the Sierra Cristal and sets up a guerrilla base, the people who join him are people who have been fighting for land rights for decades. And I then realized that there's a direct link even further back. So they had been fighting for land rights in the 50s, in the 40s. There was massive struggles with participation from the Communist Party in the 1930s in many of the sort of territories, one specifically called Realengo 18, which is the most famous. And these were armed struggles for land, to be clear. But many of those people who were in the armed struggles for land in the 1930s had also been in Cuba's war for independence. They had fought and been a part of or grew up. Their parents were Mambis. They were fighters in Cuba's war for independence against Spain. So there's a long trajectory of struggle, of land, of fighting for land, and it feeds right into the insurgency that Fidel and Raúl Castro have taken up in 1957-58. Yeah. So anyway, I initially thought I would start the book in 1959. Then I thought 1958, and now I'm like, oh, we're in the 1930s. This is where the story really starts.
Speaking of going back further in time, talk to us about the race war of 1912 in Cuba.
Yeah. Okay. So, this is interesting because there's a connection between some of what happened in the race war of 1912 and my own work, in the sense that in 1912 there were attempts by Black communities, politicians in Cuba to form a political party, the Partido Independiente de Color, the PIC. Cuba's government is not amenable to this. They're very unhappy, and they begin to repress people from the PIC. That repression, which became several massacres over the course of 1912, the movement in 1912 expands to rural areas where people, again, are fighting for land rights. And there's just a massive, massacre. The U.S. soldiers are brought in, and just, I think the numbers, we don't really know the numbers, but it's like 3,000. Some people say 8,000. Thousands of Black Cubans are just murdered in cold blood. So what ends up happening, because this was a response to attempts in Cuba by Black people to organize politically in a political party, what happens is that it's not that Black Cubans no longer fight or struggle according to race, using the category of race. It's that they know that if they do so, there can be massive repression. And so what I think happens in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, at least in the rural areas, is that Cubans begin to fight for land reform. They begin to fight for land rights. And that is a category of struggle that was accepted. Fighting as a peasant is different from fighting as a Black person. And so, but they're essentially fighting for the same things, especially in rural areas, right? So I think the connection to what essentially becomes Cuba's biggest law, the Cuban Revolution's biggest sort of most transcendent law, the agrarian reform, has a very clear connection to the repression of the 1912 attempts to create a political party based on race.
So, what role did U.S. capital and U.S. businesses and U.S. corporations play in terms of exporting Jim Crow into the island, which possibly could have helped to trigger the so-called race war of 1912?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, okay. So in Cuba was among the two last of Latin American countries to gain independence, in this case from Spain. They started, so Cuba remained a colony of Spain from 1511, and then in 1868 they began a war against the Spanish for independence. That lasts several decades, and in 1898 the Cuban independence fighters are on the verge of winning when we get what is taught in high schools in the United States as the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War, of course, was fought in Cuba, and even though here we consider it a sort of end of the Spanish Empire, on the side of the hemisphere, in Cuba, they see it as the sort of snatching of their independence. And so after the Spanish-American War is over, the Cubans are left not with Spanish to deal with, but the Americans, the United States. U.S. politicians essentially take over the island politically. There is a governor general, Governor Wood, who rules over Cuba. Cuba becomes a protectorate. And in that protectorate, a series of laws are passed allowing U.S. companies to just buy up land in Cuba. They come in, I think, so, not everyone in the United States, but many U.S. politicians fully expected to annex Cuba. And so they start to arrive in Cuba, and they bring with them their ideas, their ideologies, their money, their power, and their ideas about Jim Crow. And so they do bring Jim Crow into Cuba. They bring segregation into Cuba, and this absolutely has an effect on the 1912 attempts to sort of liberate themselves from this, in part because the race war, the independence war, the war for independence in Cuba had been fought in its majority by Afro-descended Cubans, by Black Cubans, many of them enslaved or no longer enslaved, recently enslaved, and many of them also free Blacks. When the War of Independence was over, they had been promised things like land. They had been promised a bunch of things, including a sort of a much more equal country. What Cubans had been fighting for in their independence was the end of slavery and a more equal country and nationhood. And they do not get this because the U.S. takes over, and the U.S. companies and politicians bring their culture and their sort of racist policies with them. So yeah, that absolutely feels later conflict.
Mm-hmm. Now, the focus or a focus of your study appears to be Eastern Cuba, where there are many workers with Jamaican and Haitian roots. Have you been able to uncover any of their stories?
Yeah, absolutely. So after the Haitian Revolution in 1804, many people, French and well, now Haitians, Black, so landowners, plantation owners in France, and then also workers are formerly enslaved in Haiti, cross over to Cuba. And so I think we often hear that Cuba is 90 miles from the United States. It's 90 miles from Key West, from Miami, about 100 miles. It's if there was a highway, it'd be a pretty short drive, a couple hours. But we don't hear that Eastern Cuba, Santiago, Baracoa, the easternmost point of Cuba, is just 50 miles from Haiti. And so people were able to come over and sort of restart their plantation lives on the Cuban side. And so there was also many workers from Jamaica who came in the 1920s and 1930s to work in the sugar cane cutting industry. I was interested particularly in finding some of the stories of maybe Haitians or Jamaicans who were present in the land reform and in these land struggles that took place in Eastern Cuba. And I did find an amazing case of there's in the middle of the mountains, on the tippy top of the mountains in Santiago de Cuba, there's a community of Haitian descendants of Haitians who farm coffee. They have coffee fields, who fought for agrarian reform, armed struggle for land reform, and who are quite content up there farming their coffee still. And I talked to them, and one of the people who I spoke to, I asked, I was like, did you hear about the Haitian Revolution from your parents at any point? And he was like, yeah, my dad used to talk about it all the time. And so there's a real sense, I think, that this area is very different from Havana. Havana, you've got like modernity in the 1950s. You've got that's where the majority of white Cubans are in Cuba. You know, there's all sorts of, there's fancy cars, there's roads, there's all sorts of fantastic things happening in 1950s in Havana. But the other half of the island, the other side, the other extreme of the island, Eastern Cuba, is much more precarious. It is much more abandoned. It is taken over by U.S. companies. And it is particularly the area where there were the most amount of Afro-descendants in Cuba. So I think the connection there is sort of just palpable. When you're there, if you have gone to Cuba, but you've only been to Havana, you haven't gone to Cuba. You've only been to Havana. You need to get out and go to the rural areas, go to Santiago, and you'll see a completely different world, a different country.
Finally, Professor, when can your eager readers look forward to reading this work you're preparing?
Oh my goodness. Well, I am close to finishing the manuscript, and then it'll probably be another year or so. So maybe give me about 2 years. And yeah, it should, well, I can't say what press it'll be out with yet. But yeah, there are some journal articles that people can access online that have some of these stories, especially the ones about the earlier years of the 1930s, 1950s, the sort of connections in Eastern Cuba with Black struggles for land, radical land struggles, the communists, different people who were in the Communist Party in the 1930s and 40s, and then also continued to be in it in the 1958 insurgency and beyond.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
Once again, we're back for Freedom Now, 818-985-5735. We're in our fund drive. If you haven't pledged for Freedom Now, this program hosted by Dr. Gerald Horne, please call now and pledge your support for this incredible historian, 818-985-5735. Gerald Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. In 1992, Horne was a candidate for the U.S. Senate on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He has published exclusively on W.E.B. Du Bois and has written books on neglected episodes of world history, including Hawaii and the Pacific. He writes about topics he perceives as misrepresented struggles for justice. In particular, communist struggles and struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. Much of his work highlights and analyzes specific individuals in their historic contexts, such as Lawrence Dennis, a man described as the brains behind American fascism. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, and your dollars go to support this programming, the programs here on KPFK, future programs, and the training of youth here at KPFK for the next generation. You are bringing KPFK into the future by calling 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Currently, I'm training young people. Just recently, I spoke at a high school for young kids in media relations at Dorsey High School in Los Angeles. It was an hour class, and I told the youth how important the media is to the community and my struggle in getting to where I'm at now. I believed in this station so much that I would do anything, and I'm still like that to this day. I would do anything for this station to keep it alive. I'm a yes man. Whenever I get a request or someone needs help here at the station, I always say yes, or always find a way to make it happen. And I think that's why some of us are so valuable, is that we're not no men. We don't say, nope, can't do it. And believe me, there's people here at Pacifica that did that are no longer here. They were just like, no, we can't do that. No, we can't broadcast from there. No, we can't make it happen. No, we don't have the dollars. No, we don't have the equipment. You know, that was said, and it was accepted. And it's still accepted to this day because we are on a budget, on limited funds. But if we can try to make it happen with hard work, dedication, volunteering, putting our time into it, we can make it happen. Not everything is about money. This is blood, sweat, and tears. If you believe in that statement, if there was a way that you can put your money into activism, here it is. 818-985-5735. We're in for the big fight. These 3.5 years are going to be tough, but we're going to be right here with you. 818-985-5735 and pledge your support at any amount. $25 to Dr. Gerald Horne and Freedom Now would be appreciated. Imagine if we could get at least 10 of you to pledge $25. That would be over $200. 818-985-5735. Imagine pledging $200 and we can make a match out of that. You can challenge someone else who listens to Freedom Now to pledge $200. If you pledge that $200, we can make $400 and double our money. 818-985-5735. 818-985-KPFK. Let me say it slowly. 818-985-KPFK or pledge online at kpfk.org. Now back to Freedom Now.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Professors María Elena Díaz and Sara Kozameh from UC Santa Cruz and UC San Diego, respectively. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Babadidan Kamati. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. This station is an essential resource in your life. Whether it's reliable information you can use or joyful music that inspires your community, this station provides you with programming that you rely on. You are an essential part of this station too. Listeners provide the funding that keeps the news, information, and arts alive. Listeners' money fuels this station's power to operate. So if you're going to continue to count on this station, please remember its staff and volunteers count on you. Your contribution this hour enables this essential resource to provide vibrant radio. So here's how to help. To make your pledge, call 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. Or go online to kpfk.org. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.